A queen in exile, a fugitive in the dark, and a secret that could unravel a kingdom. When Isolde, stripped of her title, carrying a child no one knew about, banished to a crumbling ruin at the edge of nowhere, pressed her fingers to a stranger's pulse in a hidden room, she didn't expect to find a dying man whose veins ran black with the same poison she had spent months illustrating for the king's apothecary. She didn't expect the man who stepped out of the shadows to grab her wrist, cold, controlled, a jaw carved from the same stone as the walls around them, and refused to let go. He had been hiding here. He had prepared this place, and he already knew exactly who she was. But if he knew, why did he let her stay? Watch till the end. The truth behind this encounter is darker and far more devastating than it first appears. The execution order lay on the table between them, like a wound no one was looking at. Isolde stood behind the queen's chair, her place, her cage, the particular gilded restraint that passed for honor in this court, and watched King Aldrich lift his quill. Around the long table, 30 lords sat with their hands folded and their eyes carefully elsewhere. The fire in the great hearth crackled. No one spoke. She had not intended to speak either. "The man is 80 years old, Your Majesty." The words came out of her before she could stop them, clear and perfectly measured, the voice she used when she read aloud from manuscripts, because that voice did not shake. "He sheltered children. The law you cite was written for traitors, not grandfathers." The quill paused above the vellum. 30 pairs of eyes moved, some to her, some away. The fire continued its indifferent crackling. Aldrich's face was pleasant. That was the thing about Aldrich. His face was always pleasant, even when he looked at you the way he was looking at her now, the way a man looks at a hound that has shown teeth when it was not invited to. Pleasant, and very still, and utterly without surprise, as though he had been waiting for this and found it, finally, useful. He signed the order without responding. The meeting continued. No one met Isolde's eyes. She understood, standing there with her hands folded and her face composed, that something had just ended. She simply did not yet know what to call it. 3 days later, the elder was executed in the market square. Isolde heard it from a window. Not the crowd, which was subdued, but the single clear sound of a blade, and then silence, and then the crowd again, filling the silence the way water fills a vessel. She pressed her palm flat against the stone of the window ledge and let herself feel the cold. And then she did not let herself feel anything for the rest of the day. 3 days after that, Aldrich came to her scriptorium in the late morning, when the light was good for working, and stood in the doorway in his gray wool and his quiet, and told her she was being sent to Thornwood Keep for rest. His tone was the tone of a man delivering a generous gift. Her illumination tools were on the table, the fine brushes arranged smallest to largest, the ground pigments in their sealed pots, the pin nibs nested in velvet. She looked at them, and then at him. "Of course, my lord," she said. She packed the tools last, wrapped each brush individually in linen, nested the pigment pots in a wool-lined box and latched it herself, refusing the maids who came to help. She was 12 weeks along, and she had told no one. She packed the rubies in their velvet pouch and left them on the dressing table. When Marin appeared in the doorway and watched her tuck the vermilion into the satchel ahead of the rubies, the older woman said nothing, until Isolde reached for the garnet earrings she'd worn on her wedding day. "My lady," Marin said, "you packed the vermilion before the rubies." Isolde considered the garnet earrings. "Put them back. One of those things," she said, "I might actually need." The journey took 3 days. The road went from cobblestone to mud to something that could only be called a road by generous interpretation. And by the second day, the carriage swayed badly enough that Isolde had to brace her elbow against the doorframe to keep her ink from spilling. Marin described, at some length, what she imagined the estate would look like. Comfortable fictions, each one more elaborate than the last. A courtyard with an herb garden, serviceable rooms, perhaps a decent hearth. Isolde listened and did not correct her. She watched the world narrow to bare November trees and the gray sky sitting low above them, and she kept her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about the sound of a blade finding its mark and the silence after it, and she stayed very quiet and very controlled, the way she had learned to stay. The carriage stopped. Isolde looked through the window. Thornwood Keep rose against a sky the color of old pewter, its stone walls black with fire damage that had happened sometime in the last century and been left unrepaired. The gatehouse had partially collapsed. The courtyard was visible through the gap. Flagstones heaved by frost, weeds growing 3 feet tall in the cracks, a well that had caved in on one side. Rain had begun to fall while they were looking at it, as though the sky had been waiting for the most effective moment. Marin made a small, controlled sound, then another. Then she was crying, quietly, competently, in the way she did everything, her hands folded in her lap and her face absolutely still, except for the tears moving down it. Isolde opened the carriage door and stepped out into the rain. She stood in the courtyard with the water soaking through her traveling cloak and her hair coming loose from its pins, and she tilted her face up to the gray sky and she laughed, fully and without restraint, the kind of laughter that came from somewhere below thought, from the part of her that had been very quiet and very controlled for a long time, and found something in the sheer, absolute perfection of this disaster that it couldn't contain. When she looked back, Marin was staring at her from the carriage doorway. The sound of that laughter hung in the wet air between them. "Marin," Isolde said when she could, "when did I last do that?" Marin considered this with unusual care. 2 years ago, she said finally, at least. The rain fell. The weeds bent under it. Somewhere in the collapsed stonework, a bird was sheltering and making its opinion known. "Good," Isolde said, and went inside to see what could be salvaged. The keep smelled of old smoke and standing water, and the particular mineral patience of stone that has been waiting for centuries and intends to keep waiting. Isolde moved through it with her sketchbook open and her charcoal moving, cataloging before she interpreted. It was the habit of her training, the discipline her master had beaten into her at 11, and that had since become how she processed the world. You look first. You record what you see. You do not decide what it means until later. The hall was structurally sound, if stripped bare. The scriptorium, a small east-facing room with stone shelves built into the walls and an intact hearth, was the best-preserved space in the building. The roof above it held. She claimed it. In the south woods, before the light faded, Marin shifted to hawk form and scouted the property. She returned with her wings carrying the smell of rain and cold earth, and she told Isolde about the collapsed well, the functioning cistern, the stores of old timber stacked against the south tower wall. She did not mention the boot prints she'd found at the tree line, fresh enough to hold the shape of their treads in the mud, or the remains of a fire built in the hollow of a fallen oak, cold now, but recently cold, the ash not yet scattered by wind. She had learned, over 20 years of service, to measure what Isolde needed against what would only add weight to what she was already carrying. Isolde was at the north tower when she noticed. The charcoal stopped. She looked at what she'd drawn, then at the wall in front of her, then back at the sketch. "The exterior wall of the north tower," she said to Marin, who was cataloging the kitchen with the expression of a woman identifying casualties, "is at least 4 feet thicker than the interior suggests." "That is," Marin said, "the least interesting problem we currently have. There's a room in this building that isn't on any plan. I would prefer there wasn't." The evening came. Marin caught 2 rabbits in hawk form and left them for Isolde, with the mute optimism of someone who believed this time would be different. Isolde consulted her memory of a monastery cookbook she had once illustrated. 3 months of drawing detailed cross-sections of roasted meats, which had not, it turned out, translated to any practical skill with a fire. She burned the first rabbit entirely, the second one less dramatically. She sat back from the smoke and looked at the ceiling and ate cold bread instead. Later, by candlelight, she returned to the sketch. She laid the exterior measurement against the interior. The numbers would not reconcile. She worked it 3 times, certain she'd made an error, and each time, the wall came up 4 feet short of accounting for itself. She went to the north tower. She moved along the wall slowly, tapping, listening to the different resonances of stone. Hollow, solid, hollow, until her knuckles found the seam. It was dressed to look like the surrounding masonry. Only someone looking for it would find it, or someone who had drawn it first. The lever was disguised as a bracket holding a rusted torch ring. When she pressed it, the section of wall swung inward 6 inches, silently, on hinges that had been oiled more recently than the rest of this building. Someone had been here. Someone had prepared this. Marin was asleep. Isolde stood at the entrance to the passage for a long moment, candle held up, listening to the cold dark inside. She should wake Marin. The boot prints in the south woods, the oiled hinges, the cold fire under the fallen oak. She should absolutely wake Marin. She went in alone. The passage spiraled up between the inner and outer walls, barely wide enough for her shoulders, the stones sweating cold moisture in the near absolute dark. Her candle was the only thing between her and blindness. She moved slowly, one hand trailing the wall, counting her steps. At the top, the passage opened into a chamber, a room built into the space between floors, perhaps 12 feet by 8, cold, airless, and occupied. A man lay on the stone floor, on his side, his breathing the labored, too careful breathing of someone managing pain rather than sleeping through it. He was perhaps 30, with a dark beard and the remains of clothes that had been quality once, before whatever had reduced them to this state. The candlelight found the veining at his throat and moved along it, black threads spreading from his collar toward his jaw, branching and darkening at the edges. Isolde knelt beside him, 2 fingers to the pulse point. She counted, and her mind went very quiet and very quick in the way it did when she was working. She knew the veining. 3 years ago, she had spent 4 months illustrating a medical manuscript, De Venenis et Antidotis, commissioned by the palace apothecary, who had been peculiarly specific about the progression diagrams. She had drawn the Shifterbane stages 8 times, in increasing detail, until the apothecary had finally nodded and said, "Yes, that is precise." She had wondered, at the time, why he needed it to be so precise. She had not asked. She was asking now, kneeling on the cold stone in the dark, the candle's light finding every branch of black in the sick man's throat. "You've been poisoned," she told him. "Shifterbane, 4th stage progression. You have perhaps 4 days. A sound behind her. Not a footstep exactly, more the absence of sound, the particular quality of air that meant something large had ceased moving. She grabbed the candle and spun. She walked directly into a chest. A hand closed around her wrist. The candle tilted sideways and shed hot wax across her knuckles, but did not go out. She drove her elbow backward, felt it connect with something solid below a ribcage, heard the exhale, and the grip did not loosen. She stamped on his foot, hard. "That," said a voice, very low and very controlled, "is the 2nd time you've done that." She twisted to face him properly, the candle between them now, and looked up. The first thing she registered was the stillness. He was not a man who moved unnecessarily. Everything about him was contained, considered, as though he had learned long ago that showing effort was a kind of expense. Dark hair, damp and pushed back from his face, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the walls around them. And eyes, gray in the candlelight, pale gray like winter sky before snow, that had seen considerable amounts of everything and had been impressed by almost none of it. He was looking at her the same way. "Who are you?" he asked. "The owner of this property." Isolde did not look away. "Who are you?" A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening, exactly, but a small recalibration, the adjustment of a man receiving information that rearranged the frame, the man whose friend is dying on your floor. She looked at the man behind her, looked back. The black veining, the 4-day window. You have the antidote? His eyes narrowed slightly, the only change in his face. How do you know what that is? I illustrated the manuscript that describes it. Do you have the antidote or not? The silence lasted long enough that she counted 4 heartbeats. Yes, he said. Then give it to him. But do not move him after, not for 10 days. The antidote requires stillness, or it fails at the cardiac stage. You're giving me medical orders. I'm giving you accurate information. What you do with it is your choice. He studied her for another 3 seconds. There was something in the study that was not simply assessment. Something behind the gray eyes that moved like something living in deep water, seen from the surface. Then he stepped back, just slightly, just enough for the candle to stop being the only thing between their faces. I'm Caius. Isolde. She looked at his hand, still loosely circling her wrist. And I would like that back. He released it. The candle flame steadied between them. Below them, the poisoned man breathed his labored breaths, and the stone of the keep pressed cold against the walls. And Isolde became aware, for the first time in 2 years, of the particular quality of the air around a person who was looking at her with his full attention. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it away and went back to the patient. Downstairs was occupied, in the way a space becomes occupied by people who know how to make themselves difficult to remove. They had spread efficiently. 2 men at the hall's entrance, 1 at the window, a woman against the far wall with her arms crossed and her eyes tracking. Marin was awake, sitting very upright in the chair Isolde had dragged to the scriptorium doorway, being politely detained by the largest man Isolde had ever seen, who was actively apologizing for it. You may stop apologizing, Marin said to him. You're still restraining me. I know, he said. I'm sorry. His name was Aldous. She would learn this later, in the way she learned most things about him. Slowly, through accumulation rather than introduction. He had the hands of a blacksmith and the voice of a man who had never quite stopped being surprised that the world could be unkind. In the corner, a boy of perhaps 19 sat with his knees together and the expression of someone who had very much wanted the previous hour to go differently. Kit. He would later demonstrate a remarkable talent for appearing in doorways at the precise moment when his presence would be most inconvenient, and a complete inability to cook anything that was not accidentally improved by burning. The woman against the wall was Sarah, 22 perhaps. She had watchful eyes and arms that had done real work and showed it. And when she looked at Isolde, she did it with the precise, measuring intensity of something deciding whether to be threatened. She looked at Caius, and then back at Isolde, and her expression did not change. Caius moved into the room, and the quality of the air changed in a way Isolde couldn't account for. Not louder, not more tense, simply more organized, as though everything in the room had oriented slightly toward a point it hadn't had a moment before. His people will move on in the morning, Caius told Isolde, once Brennan can be transported. He can't be transported for 10 days. She set her satchel on the table and opened it. I told you. We cannot stay in one place for 10 days. That is how people die. Brennan will die if you move him in less than 10 days. She pulled out her sketchbook. Those are the actual stakes. Caius looked at her with an expression that was not precisely skepticism, more the face of a man who was not accustomed to being interrupted by the current facts, and was deciding how he felt about it. You're asking me to trust a stranger's medical knowledge. I'm asking you to trust a manuscript commissioned by the man who created that poison. She opened the book to the architectural sketch she'd drawn that afternoon, the North Tower, the exterior wall annotated in her precise hand, the hidden passage marked with an arrow. She laid it on the table between them. Then she turned pages. past 3 studies of keep corbelling, past a half-finished drawing of the cistern, to the anatomical diagrams. The black vein progression, illustrated in 4 stages. Stage 4, spreading above the collarbone, reaching toward the jaw, branching at the lymph nodes. Identical, she said, to what is on your friend's throat. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Where did you get this? I painted every page of it. She watched his face. I know what it does. I know the progression. I know what the antidote requires for the binding stage to hold. A pause. Do you want him to live or not? Silence. The fire in the hearth shifted and settled. What do you want? Kaya said. Isolde set down the sketchbook and folded her hands. She laid out her terms the way she had learned to speak in council, clearly, without hesitation, making room for nothing that was not the point. His people would not touch her scriptorium or her materials. Marin would not be restrained again. They would contribute to basic repair of the keep during their stay. When they left, they would leave no trace that could connect her to them in Aldrich's eyes. And in return, he said, he had not interrupted her once. This was unusual in her experience of men. I'll manage Brennan's recovery. She paused, calculating. I can also produce a writ of passage. Aldrich's seal, his script. If your people need to move through the eastern roads. Something changed in his face. Not surprise. He was not, she suspected, a man who surprised easily. But a recalibration, the slight adjustment of a person receiving information that meaningfully altered the map. You can forge the king's hand. I spent 4 years illuminating his correspondence. She met his eyes. I know his hand better than his secretary's. He considered her across the table. In the firelight, his eyes were darker than they'd been in the passage. Less gray, more the color of old iron. She was aware that she was being evaluated with the same thoroughness she had used on the architectural plan, and she did not look away from it. In writing, he said at last. Terms in writing. Witnessed. I'll draft it now. She sat and took out her best vellum. Not the working stock, the fine skin she saved for things that needed to hold, and her pen, and she wrote the agreement in 2 clean copies in the clear script that had taken 3 years to master. When she finished, she signed her name in the full court form and pushed both copies across the table. He read both before he signed. She noted this. He read her signature. His eyes moved from the page to her face. Something shifted there, behind the iron gray, something that moved and then was still again, like a door briefly opened and closed. Isolde Vane, he said, not a question. Yes. He looked at her name once more. Whatever he recognized in it, he kept. He signed his own name below hers, no title, just the name, as though titles were a formality he had given up, along with whatever else he'd left behind, and slid 1 copy back to her without speaking. The morning found them both awake before the household, which was not, Isolde suspected, a coincidence on either side. She came into the courtyard with 2 cups of thin morning tea, a habit from court that no exile had managed to break, and found him already there, standing in the gray pre-dawn in front of the east tower, with his arms loose at his sides and his eyes moving over the cracked lintel and the failing mortar, with an expression she recognized as professional. She crossed the courtyard and held out one of the cups. He took it without looking at her. Drank. You're assessing it, she said. Old habit. What habit was that, before outlawry? The pause was a fraction of a second longer than a simple answer would have required. Architecture. She looked at him then. The set of his shoulders, the angle of his attention, the way his gaze moved along the tower face, in horizontal lines, rather than at random. Yes, that tracked. The east tower can be stabilized, he said. The lintels cracked but not failed. I noted that. She turned to look at where he was looking. It's in my sketch. He glanced at her sideways. It wasn't quite a smile. The lines of his face hadn't arranged themselves for it. But something in the corner of his mouth moved. She registered it, the way she registered a detail in a new piece of work, without yet knowing what it meant for the whole. They stood with their tea and their separate thoughts, while the sky above the keep went from black to gray to the particular pale gold that meant the sun was trying and might succeed. He actually began repairing the lintel that day, which she had not expected. He did it with his hands and without assistance, hauling stone and mixing mortar with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before and found no shame in it. She observed from the window of the scriptorium, ostensibly sketching the architectural detail for her records. The sketch did not look like architectural detail. She turned the page before anyone could see it. Sarah appeared at her shoulder, moving silently, the way she did everything. She looked at what Isolde was no longer drawing, and then out the window at Caius on the scaffolding. He was a duke's son, Sarah said. Before. Isolde opened a fresh page. Before what? Sarah didn't answer. She moved away as silently as she'd arrived, and Isolde looked at the blank page for a moment before she began drawing the lintel properly. The evenings established their own architecture. Isolde worked by candlelight at the table in the scriptorium, the only good candelabra in the keep, 7 candles making a pool of warmth in the cold room. Caius worked nearby, at the other end of the table, with maps and correspondence spread around him. They did not speak much. The fire in the hearth said more than either of them, in the language of crackling and settling. It was the 4th evening when she understood what was different about the silence. In court, silence had been performance. You were silent because you were thinking the right thoughts, composing the appropriate response, managing the space between what you knew and what you were permitted to say. The silence here was not a space being managed. It simply was. The kept and comfortable hush of 2 people engaged in separate work in the same room, neither of them pretending. She had not been in a silence like this in 2 years. She was working on a copy of a psalter, practice mostly, keeping her hand in, when he reached across the table for her penknife and stopped. His hand hovered over it for a moment. Then, "May I?" She passed it across without speaking. He took it and began sharpening a quill with the same controlled precision she used for her finest work. Not the blunt efficiency of someone doing a necessary task, but the attention of someone who understood that the tool was the work's foundation. The way he held it, the angle of the cut, the test stroke he made afterward. She was looking, and she knew it, and she didn't stop. "You're staring," he said, without looking up. "Occupational habit. I study what I'm going to draw." "And are you going to draw me?" She considered this seriously, as though it were a real question. "I haven't decided yet." He handed the penknife back. Their fingers came within a breath of each other. Did not touch. She was aware of this with a precision that had nothing to do with her professional training, and she set the knife down and returned to the psalter and did not look at his hands again for the rest of the evening. She looked at them once more. On the 6th morning, when she brought the yarrow and woundwort she and Kit had gathered from the south woods, she found Marin in the kitchen yard, grinding dried thyme against a flat stone. Aldous was beside her, feeding wood into the fire with a competence that suggested he had been doing it at her direction since the previous afternoon, and had made his peace with this. "He tells me he was a blacksmith," Marin said, without looking up. "Before." "Before what?" Isolde said. "He didn't say." "Neither did you." Marin lifted her eyes from the stone. The look was not an accusation. It was something quieter and more thorough than that. "You packed the vermilion before the rubies." "I know. That was 3 weeks ago." Marin put down the stone. "You haven't told him. There's nothing to tell yet." "Isolde, I know." She took the time and went inside, alone with Brennan on the 7th day, when he was lucid enough for conversation, and she was checking the fading of the veining at his throat. She learned fragments. The veining had receded below his collarbone. His pulse was steadying. When she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the fever was not gone, but it had become negotiable, the kind that retreats overnight and returns in the afternoon, but by smaller increments each time. "You're going to live," she told him. I know. He watched her work. He had the directness of a man who had been close to death and found small talk wasteful on the other side of it. He built the gatehouse plans while I was unconscious. I know. I found them. He builds things when he's worried. Has since we were boys. She pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point under his jaw, counting. Regular. Strengthening. Is he worried often? Less than he used to be. A pause. More than he lets on. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. He doesn't trust easily. I noticed. He trusts you faster than most. I'm not sure that's trust, she said. I think it's information. He trusts the information. She released his wrist. That's different. Brennan considered this with the patience of a man who had known Caius for most of his life, and had formed conclusions she hadn't. Perhaps, he said. There's something else. Don't. She folded the used linen into a neat square. I haven't said anything. I know what you were going to say. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ring of Aldous' hammer reached them through the east wall. Steady, deliberate, the sound of something being made whole. He has a sister. Had. Her hands went very still over the linen. Had. Alara. She was. He stopped. He doesn't speak of her. I know, Isolde said, very quietly. I know who she was. Brennan's eyes found her face with the careful attention of a man reassessing the shape of something he thought he understood. He did not ask. He looked at the ceiling again, and she gathered her things, and neither of them said anything for a while. There's one more thing, he said, as she reached the door. She waited. His wrist. Brennan's voice was even, but there was something underneath it, the sound of a weight held carefully. Left side. He's been keeping his sleeve down. She stood at the door for 3 full seconds. How long? She asked. He found it 2 weeks before we came here. A pause. He told me not to tell you specifically. He said. Brennan stopped, arranged something behind his eyes, continued. He said it would change things between you. He didn't want things to change. She stood with her hand on the doorframe and looked at the passage wall and let the cold of the stone come through her palm. Don't tell him I know, she said. Not yet. She went back to her work. Her hands were very still. She stared at the psalter for a long time before she picked up the pen, and when she did, the first stroke was heavier than she intended, and she blotted it and began again. That night, she woke at an hour past midnight. She lay still for a moment, listening to the keep's small noises. The creak of cooling stone, Marin's quiet breathing from the next room. Then she rose and went to the window. Caius was in the courtyard below, in the moonlight, his shirt pushed up on his left arm, examining his own wrist with a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. This was the careful stillness of a man taking inventory, measuring something he did not want to measure. Even from this distance, in the pale moonlight, she could see the mark. Black threads, faint, barely visible, curling from inside his wrist toward the forearm, the beginning of a branching that she had drawn 8 times in increasing detail until the apothecary had said, yes, that is precise. He lowered his sleeve. He stood for a moment with his head slightly bowed, and she watched him and understood, with a clarity that felt like something being pressed flat inside her chest, several things at once. The only antidote was in the king's private dispensary. She had left the king's dispensary 3 weeks ago. She turned from the window and went to bed, and lay on her back in the dark with her eyes open. And she thought about what it means to keep a secret from someone, because you don't want to watch them worry, and whether that is kindness or something that only resembles it. The blood on the corridor floor was not much, a trail, not a pool. The marks of a man who had kept moving and told himself it was fine. Day 6 of 10. Isolde followed it. The small room at the end of the passage had once been a salt store, from the mineral residue on the walls. Caius was sitting against the far wall with his shirt off and a piece of linen held against his left side, already soaked through. his jaw set in the particular way of someone who had decided against making noise and was holding to that decision. She stood in the doorway. He looked at her. "How long have you been sitting here?" she asked. "Long enough to know I can't reach it," he said. His voice was even, completely even. "Why didn't you—" "Because Edric would have told Brennan. Brennan would have tried to get up." A pause. "As you explained." She came into the room. She set the candle on the floor and knelt beside him and moved his hand away from the wound. A knife slash, long and following the curve of his ribs toward his hip. Days old, she looked at the edges and felt the heat rising from them, and understood that this had been a problem he had been managing since before he arrived here, carrying it the way he carried most things, through the force of deciding not to put it down. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "It was fine sooner." She looked at him. "It was manageable sooner," he amended. She went to the scriptorium and gathered what she had: distilled wine, clean linen, rendered tallow for drawing salve, the dried herbs from her morning with Kit, yarrow, woundwort, thyme. She came back and sat beside him on the floor, not across the room, not at a respectful distance. Beside him. "This will hurt," she said. "I know." She pressed the wine-soaked cloth to the wound. He did not make a sound. The muscle along his jaw tightened, and the tendon in his neck went taut, and his breathing became even more controlled, slower and more deliberate, like someone counting. "You can make noise," she said. "I'm fine. The man who didn't move until his shirt was soaked through is fine." She kept her voice level. "Noted." A beat of silence. "You're angry," he said. She paused in the cleaning, resumed. "I'm precise. This needs to be done precisely." He said nothing. She worked, and the candle made the only light, and outside the small room the keep was very quiet. She became aware, at some point, of the specific quality of the silence, that it was the same silence as the evenings at the table, the same inhabited quiet, except now she could feel the warmth of him through the linen and hear the carefully managed movement of his breathing, and smell the cold stone and the wine, and underneath both of those, the particular human warmth of a person trying to stay very still for her. "Your hands," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her hands, the left one holding the wound steady, the right applying the salve with the same attention she brought to her finest illumination work. Something in his expression had changed, in a way she didn't entirely trust herself to read. "They're very still," he said. "Illumination. You learn to hold them still, or you ruin the work." "How long did it take?" 3 years before my master stopped watching over my shoulder. She set the first stitch. "I was 11 when I started." This surprised him. She could see it, not in movement, he rarely moved for surprise, but in the fraction of a second where his eyes shifted focus. "Since you were 11. My father thought it would make me a better court wife. Educated, artistic, quiet." She set the second stitch. He was half right. "I am educated and artistic." A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh, cut short by the pull of the thread. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be." She worked. The stitching required full concentration, and she gave it, and the room contracted down to the circle of candlelight, and the wound under her hands, and the sound of his breathing 6 inches from her shoulder. She tied off the third stitch. The fourth. Pressed the drawing salve carefully along the closed edges. "Caius. Yes. Who is Alara?" The silence lasted 4 full seconds. She counted them in the rhythm of her work. "My sister," he said. She tied off the last stitch, smoothed the linen over it. Her hand rested there for a moment, just the flat of her palm against the bandage, just long enough to feel the steadiness of his heartbeat through the cloth. Alive. Here. For now. "Was," he said. She didn't ask more. She took the long strip of linen and began wrapping it around his torso, which required proximity that could not be disguised as anything practical. Her arms went around him to pass the bandage from hand to hand. His fingers found the back of her wrist, not gripping, just resting. A point of contact, light as a question. "Aldrich?" she said, very quietly. "Yes," she worked. Neither of them spoke. The candle had burned a third of the way down. She was his wife, Caius said. His first. She couldn't. He said she failed him. Within a year, she was dead. They said it was grief. His voice was the voice he used for everything. Level, controlled, without variance. She had learned, in 10 days, that this was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling that had been carried for so long it had become load-bearing. I was at court. I attended the funeral. I wore the appropriate clothes and said the appropriate things, and went home to my comfortable rooms. A pause. I did not ask why a healthy woman of 23 died of grief in a fortnight. Isolde tied the bandage. She did not move away immediately. "I have been asking that question every day for 3 years, he said. She pulled back just enough to look at him. The candlelight made his eyes darker than she'd seen them. Not gray now, something deeper than gray. The color of lake water in November. Something in the look was terribly unguarded, as though the blood loss and the room's smallness and the long hour had removed a layer of the careful distance he kept between himself and the world. "I know what Aldrich does," she said, "to wives who disappoint him." Something moved through his expression. "You were his wife, his third." She held his gaze. "I contradicted him in open court. That's why I'm here, not there." A pause. "Not the only reason. Though that reason is also true." He looked at her for a long time. The candlelight moved between them. "How are you not frightened?" "I am frightened," Isolde said. "I am frightened constantly. I've simply had a great deal of practice continuing to function while frightened." He reached up, slowly enough that she could have moved, could have turned it into something else, and touched her face. Just his fingers, at the line of her jaw, barely a touch. More like acknowledgement, like, "I see you. I see this." The candle guttered. Neither of them moved. From down the corridor, Brennan, coughing, the wet, productive sound of a man whose lungs were beginning to clear. Caius dropped his hand. The moment separated cleanly, like a page turned. Isolde stood, gathered her supplies. At the door, she paused with her back still to him. "Don't let it reach that stage again," she said. "Next time, ask." She left him sitting against the wall, in the cooling candlelight, with his hand still slightly raised. Day 10. The black veining was gone. Brennan stood. He did it badly. One hand braced on the wall, his legs uncertain, his color not quite what it should be. But he stood, and something happened in the keep that Isolde could only describe as a collective exhale. Aldous, who had been carrying the weight of it more visibly than anyone, set down his hammer and pressed the back of his hand to his mouth for a moment. Kit, who had been pretending to organize kindling in the doorway, stopped pretending. She watched from the doorway. Caius was across the room, leaning against the wall, watching Brennan with an expression that she had not seen on him before, and recognized as the thing people's faces do when they have been quietly terrified for a long time and have been given, without warning, permission to stop. He didn't smile. His face didn't rearrange itself into celebration. He simply looked at his friend, standing unsteadily in the middle of the floor, and the breath he released was slow and long, and she looked away before he could catch her looking. The fire lesson happened 2 days later, in the afternoon, in the corner of the courtyard where the wind came off the wall and made everything more difficult than it needed to be. He had offered without preamble, "Do you know how to make fire without a flint?" And she had said, "No." And he had said, "Sit here," and produced a fire bow and a hearthboard with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who was comfortable teaching what he knew. He demonstrated once. The coal formed in under a minute. She tried. The bow skipped. He didn't comment. She tried again. The pressure was wrong. He moved her hand, slightly, adjusting the grip, A brief contact, his fingers over hers, correcting the angle, and then stepped back. "Keep the pressure even," he said. "Don't force it." She tried again. Again. 5 times. 7. "You're not frustrated," she observed on the 8th attempt, the bow moving steadily now. "Should I be? Most people would be. By now." "You're doing it correctly," he said. "It just hasn't caught yet." She looked up at him briefly, his arms loose at his sides, his attention fully on her hands, not the way people at court had watched her, with the quality of waiting for something to judge, but the clean attention of someone who was simply there and interested in what she was doing. She looked back down at the hearthboard. The 8th time, the coal caught. She watched the small glow appear in the charcloth and for a moment didn't breathe. And then she blew on it very carefully, the way he'd shown her, and the tinder caught, and a small, real, entirely personal flame appeared in the hollow of her hands. "There," Kaya said, "just that." But he was smiling, fully, the muscles of his face actually arranging themselves for it, and she saw, in the instant before she looked back at the fire, what he must have looked like before all of this. The Duke's son, the architect, the person he'd been building back toward, badly, in the ruins of a decommissioned border keep. She kept her eyes on the flame. Her heart was doing something she decided not to examine. He found her manuscripts on a quiet evening near the end of their time, asked carefully whether he could look. She passed the book across without comment and returned to her work. He turned the pages slowly. She was aware of the sound of each one, the small, considered movement of a man who understood that these things had weight. She did not watch him. She watched the candle. He stopped at a particular page, a silence that had a different quality than the usual ones. "You drew us," he said. She looked at the page without looking like she was looking at it. It was Thornwood Keep, as it currently stood. The courtyard, the repaired east tower, figures moving through it. Aldous at the forge with Marin, Kit crossing toward the hall. Caius himself on the scaffolding, viewed from above and slightly behind, unmistakable in the set of his shoulders. "I drew what was here," she said. "We're not usually drawn." He turned the page with the same care. "Recorded. We try not to leave evidence. I'm not leaving this behind." She reached across and closed the cover. "It's mine." His hands stopped. He looked at where her hands had pressed the cover closed, and then he looked at her, and she felt the look like a temperature change. Not warm, not cold, something that arrived before either category applied. "What will you do with it?" he asked. "Keep it," she said. "Remember." The candle burned. They were close enough at the table that when he reached to slide the book back toward her, his forearm passed 6 inches from hers, and the movement of air was something. Present. She felt it on her skin. Exiled. Yes. She was looking at the book. When this is over. The door opened. Sarah stood in the doorway, and the look on her face ended the sentence before it finished. And the cold that came in with her was not only from the night. "Aldrich's men are on the North Road," she said. 2 days out. The room changed. Everything in it changed. Isolde closed her sketchbook, picked up her pen. "Then we have work to do," she said. The question hung in the air behind her, unanswered, like a half-illuminated page set aside. Lord Fenwick arrived at Thornwood under a white flag on a gray morning, with 2 outriders and the particular composure of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves before he entered. He was elegant. He had the kind of face that had learned to look kind, the way a document learns to look official, through repetition and the right materials. He asked for Isolde by name. In the middle of the courtyard, with the full Thornwood company present, and the cold light finding every face. His Majesty, Fenwick said pleasantly, would like his wife returned. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of the 20 or so people who had just received information about the woman they'd spent 10 days cooking and working and bleeding beside. They waited until Fenwick had been escorted to the outer yard. Then the full architecture of their feelings made itself known. Brennan looked at her with something quiet and crushed in his face. "You were the queen. You burned the first 2 batches of rabbit," Kit said. He appeared to mean this seriously, as though it was relevant, as though queens did not burn things. Aldous said nothing. He looked at Marin, and Marin looked back at him. And something passed between them that Isolde couldn't read. And then Aldous put down his tools and walked outside. Sarah said nothing for a moment. The moment stretched long enough to have an edge. Then, "You sat at his table. You wore his colors. My mother died in a village he taxed into starvation, and you—" "I know." Isolde did not raise her voice. She did not look away. She let the words land and did not try to redirect them. "I sat in council, and I was permitted to listen, and not permitted to speak. Until the one time I did, and he exiled me for it. I know it isn't enough. I know I should have done more, sooner, better." She looked at Sarah directly. "I know." "Then what exactly do you want from us?" "I want to fix it." A pause. "I need your help to do that." In the corner of the room, Kit was looking at his boots. His Latin was improving. They had started 3 days ago, after Sarah had volunteered nothing for a week, and then appeared one evening with a question about a word she'd seen on the vellum, and it had gone from there. He had the particular stillness of a young man trying to decide what he thought, without the influence of everyone else's faces. Caius had said nothing throughout. He stood at the edge of the room, and she had not been able to look at him, and she looked at him now. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. There was no anger in it. There was something heavier than anger, something that had been carrying weight for a long time, and had just found the weight increased, and had not yet determined whether it was a burden or a ballast. When the others had dispersed, Sarah out the east door, Kit after her, Brennan to his pallet to rest because standing for extended periods still cost him, Caius crossed the room and stood in front of her, not close, the length of the table between them. "You knew who I was," he said, "the night you found Brennan. You knew who I was when you read my signature." She kept her voice level. "The Queen's Illuminator. My name was on every document from the palace for 4 years. Yes. And yet you stayed. And yet you stayed," he repeated. A long silence lived between them. "Ilara Dre," she said quietly. They changed her name in the histories, as if she'd always been his. The breath he drew was not quite audible. "When did you know?" "The morning after I arrived. When I saw Brennan's veining and recognized the poison from the apothecary's manuscript." She held his gaze. "I knew what it was used for. I knew who was being hunted. I recognized your name in the court records, the Duke of Dre's second son. I knew whose brother I was standing in front of. And you helped anyway. She deserved someone who helped." Her voice was steady, just barely, even if it was too late. Even if it was the wrong person. Even if it was very small. He crossed the room. He stopped close enough that she would have had to raise her chin to look at him properly. And she did, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him since the small room with the candle. "It wasn't too late," he said. And it wasn't the wrong person. Fenwick was brought back in. Caius listened to the full offer, Isolde's return for the company's amnesty, with the patience of a man who had listened to many offers and understood their architecture. He let Fenwick finish. He let the silence after it run long enough to be uncomfortable. Then, "No," Fenwick pressed. Caius listened with the same patience and said no again, and this time added, "Ride back to Aldrich. Tell him she's under Thornwood's protection." Fenwick looked at Isolde, looked at Caius, read the room with the thorough, professional attention of a man whose entire value was in knowing what rooms contained. He found something in what he read that he filed away behind his pleasant face, and he smiled, very slightly, and bowed, and left. "That will bring soldiers," Isolde said. "I know." She looked at him. He was already looking at her, and he said we'll be ready, in the tone he used for things he had decided, and she believed him, which was strange, because she had not believed anything a man told her with confidence in quite some time. The documents took 3 nights. Isolde worked by candlelight. Property deeds, letters of transfer, a legal labyrinth of overlapping claims that would take Aldrich's lawyers months to unpick if they found it. Which was the point? Caius brought candles at midnight without being asked. He came back at 3 in the morning with bread and dried meat and a clay cup of something warm. And he set them beside her without speaking, and she ate without looking up. And this, too, became part of the evening's architecture. The second night, Sarah sat beside her, voluntarily, for the first time. She watched Isolde work, asked what she was writing, listened to the answer with her arms crossed, and her expression doing nothing in particular. "My mother used to say, the king's laws were built for the king," Sarah said finally, "not the people." "Your mother was correct." A pause. "She died of fever. We couldn't afford the medicine." The words were delivered evenly, the way someone delivers something they have carried in their chest for a long time and have learned to carry without spilling. "I know," Isolde said. "Not your mother specifically, but I know. And I'm sorry I didn't do more, sooner." She did not stop writing. "I'm trying to do it now." Sarah watched the pen move. "You speak Latin?" "Yes. Teach me to read it. While we're here." Isolde looked at her. The look that came back was not warm. It was too proud for warm, too careful. But it was open in a way it hadn't been before. A door ajar rather than closed. "All right," Isolde said, and turned back to the vellum. On the night before the expected soldiers, Caius told her she was leaving. He did it at the table, looking at the maps, his voice with the practical quality he used for logistics and the administration of necessary things. "No," she said, "it's safer. You don't have the right to decide what risks I take with my life." "Isolde." He looked at her then, finally looked up from the maps, and there was something in his face that she had not seen before, a crack in the careful surface. "If something happens to you here, then it happens." She kept her voice steady. "I will not be put somewhere safe. I spent 4 years in places that were safe, while everything happened to everyone else through a window. I know what that is. I won't go back to it." He looked down. The muscle of his jaw worked once. "Please." The word landed differently than the rest of the sentence. She could hear the cost of it, the particular cost of a man who did not ask for things, asking. "Ask me something else," she said, quietly. A long silence. "I can't ask you to stay. You already did." She held his gaze. "The night you refused Fenwick." He didn't answer. She rose and went to bed, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the keep settle around her. And she thought about the cost of that single word, and what it meant from a man who she had never heard ask for anything. In the morning, the horses were saddled. She rode for 4 hours. The road was mud and rain and the gray sameness of countryside that didn't care about her situation. And she sat straight in the saddle with the rain on her face and her hands loose on the reins. And she thought about what it means to be somewhere safe while everything happens to everyone else through a window. She had spent 4 years knowing the answer to that question. She turned around. She arrived at Thornwood's gate at midday in the rain, alone, wet through, her horse's breath making clouds in the cold air. She dismounted and walked to the gate and knocked. Kit opened it, stared at her with enormous eyes. "Tell Caius I'm back," she said, "and if he tries to send me away again, I'll forge a document revoking his land rights." Kit disappeared. She stood in the rain. He came back. "He says to come in out of the rain." She walked through the gate. Caius was across the courtyard, arms crossed, standing in the place he had stood on the first morning with his cup of thin tea, watching her cross the distance toward him. She walked through the rain-soaked flagstones, and the weeds, and the everything, and she stopped in front of him. "I turned around," she said. "I see that. Don't do it again." A long beat. "I can't promise that." "Try." He looked at her. This completely wet woman who had ridden away and chosen to come back. And something in his face gave way all the way down. Not completely, not dramatically, but something that had been held very carefully for a very long time was briefly not held. "I'll try," he said. The rain fell on both of them. The night before the soldiers were expected, the keep went very quiet. Not the silence of the evenings, not the working quiet, the inhabited silence of two people at separate tasks in the same warmth. This was the silence of a held breath, the silence of something about to be decided. Isolde sat in the scriptorium with her hands in her lap and nothing in front of her. She was not working. The candles burned. Caius found her there. He came in and sat across from her, and for a while there was only the fire and the candles and the sounds of the keep at night. Aldous moving somewhere in the hall, the wind finding the east tower, the particular creak of the third step of the north stair that had never been repaired. Then, "I need to tell you something, before tomorrow." "All right," she said. "I've known who you were since I read your name on the agreement. The Queen's Illuminator. The woman who contradicted Aldrich in open court." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I didn't come here to find. I came here for the keep, the strategic position. I did not come here to find—" He stopped. Burned rabbit and an architect's eye? Something broke open in his face, adjacent to a laugh, not quite there, but in the same territory. "You," he said, simply. "I didn't come here to find you." "That makes two of us," she said. The candles burned between them. Outside, the wind moved against the repaired east tower, the tower he had fixed with his own hands, while she watched from the window and pretended she was drawing stone. "I love you," Caius said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without ornament, without the architecture of explanation. The way he'd signed the agreement, his name alone, requiring no title. "I don't know what to do with it, but you should know, before tomorrow." She looked at him for a long moment. His eyes in the candlelight were the dark gray of deep water. She had drawn those eyes twice, and each time failed to get the color right. And she understood now that the problem was not her skill. The color changed depending on what he was looking at. She crossed the room and she sat beside him. Not across the table, beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. And she took his left hand and turned it, gently, and pushed his sleeve back. The veining was there. Fine, dark threads, barely visible in the candlelight, curling from the inside of his wrist toward the forearm. She held his wrist in both hands and looked at it for a moment. He said nothing. He was completely still. The particular stillness of a man who has been found out and is deciding whether to speak first. "How long?" she said. "Since before I came here, you knew I'd recognize it." "Yes, that's why you told Brennan not to tell me." A pause. "I didn't want you to worry." Another pause. "I didn't want to be the reason you looked at me differently." She pressed her thumb very gently to the inside of his wrist, to the veining, to the place where the threads began. She felt his pulse against her fingertip. "The antidote," she said, "is in the king's private dispensary." "I know." "Then you know why I have to go back." He turned his head to look at her. She was already looking at him. "That's why," he said. "That's the other reason you're going back." It was always one of the reasons. She did not look away. "Now it's more urgent." He closed his hand around hers, slowly, the way he did everything deliberate, and held it. "I should have told you." "Yes. I know what you didn't want." She looked at their hands. "I understand the impulse. It's the same impulse that makes a man sit alone in a salt store with a wound that's been festering for days." She met his eyes. "You are allowed to be the thing that needs help. You don't always have to be the thing doing the holding." He was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind ran along the repaired tower, and the keep held against it. "Isolde," he said. "Yes." "Come here." She was already there. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her, and for a while neither of them spoke. The candles burned down another inch. The fire shifted and settled. The keep breathed around them, old stone and new mortar, the smell of cold air and wood smoke, and the particular quality of a room where people have been working and living and beginning, gradually, to trust. "I love you," she said, into the warmth of his shoulder. Clearly, without ceremony, the way a door opens when you have been standing on the other side of it long enough to know what you're doing. He turned and pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "I know." "You insufferable!" He held her tighter. She stayed. The plan was Isolde's. She laid it out at the table the following morning, with her maps and her documents, and the particular clarity she brought to complex illumination work. First the structure, then the detail, never the other way around. "I go back," she said. Not as his runaway wife, as his returning queen, offering him what every king most wants. Brennan looked at her steadily. What does he most want? To have been right. About everything. She placed her hands flat on the table. "I will give him the appearance of that, while I take everything else." She was 15 weeks along. The sickness had eased in the past fortnight, and what had replaced it was a steadier awareness, a sense of something growing alongside her plans and her fear, patient and indifferent to strategy. She had told Caius the night before, quietly, in the dark, with his hand on her belly and the candle burned to nothing. He had not spoken for a long moment. When he did, it was only her name. She looked at him across the table now. He was looking at her with the expression he wore when he had already calculated the outcome and found it unacceptable, and was preparing to argue against his own knowledge. "I know what I'm doing," she said, before he could start. "I know that building. I know that man." She placed her hands on either side of his face. She had done this only once before, and the once had been sufficient to teach her things about his face that she was still understanding. "Trust me the way I trusted you in that passage. In the dark, with nothing. That was different." "How?" The silence before his answer was 3 seconds long. "I wasn't in love with you in the passage," he said. She kissed him, brief, certain. "I'll come back," she said. "I always come back." She returned to court magnificent. That was the only word for it. She walked through the palace gates in the gown she'd had made in the nearest town. Dark blue, the color of a woman who had been composing herself for a return, and had done it correctly. And she was 5 months along, and she let them see it. And she let Aldrich see it. And she watched the calculation move across his pleasant face like weather. "My lord," she said, "I have come home." She was given the Queen's chambers. Ilara's portrait looked at her from above the fireplace, with Ilara's dark eyes, brown, not gray, but the shape of them was the same, the particular set that came from the same blood. "I'm here," Isolde told the portrait, "every evening, late." Wrong person. Very small. She paused. But here. She attended council meetings and took her notes and was underestimated by every man in the room, which was the only thing she was counting on. She studied Aldrich the way she had once studied manuscripts, looking for the pattern beneath the visible surface, the structure underlying the decoration. She found what she had expected to find. A man who needed to be the author of every story, even the ones he had not written. She would give him that, and she would write something else underneath it. The forged documents were written in Fenwick's hand. She had studied it briefly, years ago, when his correspondence had passed through the scriptorium for copying, and her memory for script was as exact as her memory for anything visual. She wrote slowly, over 3 nights, 2 letters, 3 receipts of payment, a fragment of what appeared to be a private arrangement. Each one different enough to look accidental, similar enough to look like evidence. She placed them carefully, in files Aldrich's secretaries would find in the natural course of their work. She sat back and waited. Lord Fenwick was a man of considerable intelligence, and a survival instinct that had outlasted 4 administrations. When he felt Aldrich's suspicion beginning to rotate toward him, in the small ways it showed, the seating at table, the shortening of audiences, he did not collapse into innocence. He did what men with his skills did when given no good options. He made use of the frame. He was accused of conspiracy. He conspired. He had the connections. He had the motive. He had, thanks to Isolde, the reputation. Within 6 weeks of her return, he had made contact with 2 border lords and the city guild. Isolde sat with this information in Alara's chair by Alara's fire and considered what she had built. The trap had become the architecture of something real. She had intended to manufacture a threat. She had manufactured one, and it had, with Fenwick's considerable assistance, become genuine. The border lords wanted reform. The guild wanted protection from the arbitrary taxation. Fenwick, whatever his original motives, had given them a direction. She could unmake it. She had the evidence. She could walk into Aldrich's presence and deliver Fenwick, and watch the paranoia do the rest. She sat with the fire and the portrait and thought about a village taxed into starvation, and a healthy woman of 23 dead of grief in a fortnight, and the sound of a blade finding its mark in a market square. And she thought about what it means to do more, sooner, better. She let Fenwick's coalition continue. She extracted the antidote on a Tuesday, in a breadbasket, via the woman who had been Alara's personal maid, and who had never, in 3 years, stopped grieving her. The woman wrapped the vial in linen and packed it under the bread, and asked nothing about where it was going. Isolde watched the cart leave the palace yard. She stayed. 2 months, she wrote, in the cipher she and Caius had agreed. When the child is born, we move. The window opened on a night in the 7th week, when the city had gone quiet and the guard had recently changed. She did not scream. She was past screaming at windows. She set down her pen, crossed the room, and took hold of the front of his shirt with both hands. His arms came around her immediately. No pause, no question, simply around her, his hands at her back, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her cheek, and breathed the smell of cold night air and stone that meant him, now, that she had apparently filed away without intending to. His heart was steady. She counted the beats. "You're shaking," he said, very quietly. "I know. Are you?" "Better now." She kept her face against his chest. "Don't ask." He held her. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was cold, and outside the city spread in every direction, enormous and indifferent, and she felt the specific quality of warmth that was him, specifically. The warmth of a person whose presence was familiar in a way she had not expected to know, and now could not imagine unknowing. "The veining," she said, finally. "Gone." His voice was low, close to her hair. 3 days after the vial arrived. She let out a breath against his shirt. "Good." "The antidote required stillness," he said. "Brennan made me lie down for 4 days. He was extremely pleased with himself about this." She almost laughed, as he should be. He pulled back enough to look at her face. She let him. Whatever he found there, he held it without comment. Only the slight tightening of his hands at her back that she had learned to read. "Fenwick has found allies," he said. 3 border lords, the church faction, the guild. "I know. I made that happen." She met his eyes. "More than I intended." She felt him almost laugh. "You made a trap and caught something larger than the trap." "It's not a trap anymore." She stepped back enough to look at him properly. In the dim light, his eyes were darker than usual, the black gray of deep water at night. "Fenwick's coalition is real. The grievances are real. We don't need to overthrow a king. We need to make the alternative obvious." She took his hand and placed it against her belly, held it there. The child moved, a small, undeniable insistence. "Born in lawful marriage," she said, "raised by people who know what a kingdom is supposed to be." Something moved through his face that she did not have words for. He went to his knee, there in the dim light, one knee on the cold floor, and his hand still at her belly. And she said, "Don't you dare." And he did it anyway. "I swear to you," he said, "we will make this work." She pulled him up by his collar. "Good. Now get out before the guard changes." He kissed her at the window, her face tilted up to his, the city spread out behind him in the moonlight, enormous and indifferent, and about to be changed. And she held the front of his shirt and kissed him back. "I love you," she said, for the first time standing upright in a room with other light sources. Clearly and without ceremony, like a door opened the whole way. He smiled, the full one, the one that changed his face back into something she could imagine in daylight, in peacetime, in a courtyard repaired by his own hands. "I know," he said, "you insufferable." He went out the window. She stood at the sill and listened to his absence and felt the cold air on her face and the child moving in her belly, and the distant particular weight of everything that was still to be done. And underneath all of it, the unmistakable quality of something that had been chosen, not fallen into, not arrived at by default. Chosen. She was working on the history, the true one, the one where Alara Dre's name appeared in its proper form, where the Thornwood Company appeared as what they had actually been, where the record was not the record of the victor's preference, but of what had actually occurred. The afternoon light came through the east window in the particular way it did in spring, when the angle was still low enough to reach the table, and she was deep enough in the work that she didn't hear him come in. He set the candles down beside her. She didn't look up. He always brought candles when she was working in low light. She had not asked him to. He had simply noticed, somewhere in the course of 10 days and several months and a revolution, that her eyes tracked the light quality in a room the way his tracked structural integrity, and he had decided this was his problem to solve. He stood beside her and read over her shoulder. "You put me in it. You're in the story. I'm not sure I should be in a history. I'm still alive. I'm being proactive." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the quality of his silence, the specific weight of it, the way it gathered rather than dispersed. She had learned to read his silences the way she read manuscripts, not word by word, but for structure, for the shape of what was being organized beneath the surface. "Marry me," he said. She did not stop writing. "You're going to need to be more specific than that. Marry me, properly, in front of witnesses, with documents you didn't forge." She put the pen down. She looked up at him. He was looking back at her with the expression she had first seen in a candlelit passage with his hand around her wrist. The expression she now understood to be the version of him that was not performing anything, not managing anything, simply present. The Duke's son and the architect, and the man who had built a gatehouse plan while his best friend was dying. Because building is what you do when you have to put the fear somewhere. "That was terrible," she said. "I know." "Say yes anyway." "Obviously," she said, and kissed him. Thornwood Keep stood. The gatehouse was rebuilt, the east tower solid, the courtyard cleared and flagged and occupied by the ongoing comfortable noise of people who lived in a place, rather than sheltering in it. The great hall held the last of the winter's wounded, soldiers from both sides of the last battle, tended by Brother Edric, who had opinions about the placement of the herb beds, and was usually wrong and knew it, and complained anyway. In the corner of the outer hall, Sarah and Kit bent over a piece of vellum. His Latin was improving, slowly, in the way that things improve when the teacher has high standards and declines to lower them, but improving. Sarah's patience with his mistakes had surprised everyone who had known her before. Kit himself seemed mildly astonished by it. He did not press his luck. Aldous was at the forge with the particular contentment of a man who had been given a good fire and a clear task, and no one telling him what to do. Marin watched him from the gatehouse parapet in hawk form. Her feathers ruffled slightly against the morning cold, and when he looked up, She tilted her head at the precise angle that meant, "You're doing it wrong." And he laughed up at her and did it the way he'd been doing it all along. In the courtyard, in a basket near the well, a dark-haired child was awake and making his opinions about this known. He had gray eyes. Neither Isolde nor Caius had gray eyes in that particular shade, which was a source of ongoing private discussion and no conclusions. They had agreed, finally and without resolution, that it was the kind of thing that didn't need explaining. Some things simply are what they are. Caius was crouched by the basket with one finger extended. The child's hand had closed around it, small and absolute, with the grip of someone who had made a decision and intended to keep it. Caius had not moved in approximately 20 minutes. He had the look of a man who understood, with complete clarity, that he was being held, and who had, apparently, no interest in being anywhere else. Isolde came and stood beside him. He looked up at her briefly, the gray eyes in daylight, in peacetime, in the morning light of a courtyard that was theirs, and then looked back at the child, who continued to regard the world with the focused attention of someone who was very new to it and finding it more interesting than expected. "He's going to let go," she said. "Not yet," Caius said. She looked at his face, the angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, which she had drawn in charcoal on a page she kept in a book she did not show to anyone. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because some things are for keeping, not for showing. Some things are for the record you make for yourself, the illumination no one commissions, the history you write because it was real, and you were there, and it deserved to be true. The child made a small, satisfied sound and tightened his grip. "Good," Caius said. "Just that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Just a moment. Just the weight of it. The particular warmth of him in the morning air. "Good," she agreed. The history Isolde Vane wrote was completed in the spring of that year. In it, the name Alara Dre appeared in its correct form, in the correct place, restored to the record as though it had never been taken. Some later historians noted this correction, without knowing who had made it or why. The manuscript still exists. In the margin of the dedication page, in the clear, precise hand of someone who had been writing things down since the age of 11, there is a small drawing, a fire bow, a piece of char cloth, a single flame caught in the hollow of two hands. No note, just the image, just the record of something that had been. Thornwood Keep was never really about stone and mortar. It was about two people, both carrying wounds they refused to name, both moving through the world with careful hands and quieter hearts, who found in the wreckage of everything they'd lost something neither of them had gone looking for. Isolde didn't return to court for glory. She returned for a vial of antidote hidden in a breadbasket, for a name restored to the historical record, for every person who had suffered behind a window she once looked through and did nothing. And Caius, a man who built things when he was afraid, built a gatehouse plan while his best friend was dying. Because some people love by doing, by showing up, by fixing the lintel with their own hands. The greatest act of courage in this story wasn't the revolution. It was the moment each of them said, "I am allowed to need something. I am allowed to ask." That is the story. That is the lesson. If this story left something sitting in your chest, a feeling you can't quite name yet, drop it in the comments. We genuinely read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and the bell. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to us. Thank you for being here. Truly.